Marcus stood outside the restaurant doors, feeling the cool evening air brush against his carefully selected gray button-up shirt. He'd spent 3 hours preparing for this night. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the streetlights above. In his jacket pocket, wrapped in velvet and anticipation, sat a small box containing a promise. Not quite an engagement ring, but something significant. Something that meant he was ready to take the next step with Sarah, the woman he'd loved for 4 years. The restaurant was called Mirrorstone, a place they'd discovered together during a weekend getaway to the city. The kind of place where soft jazz played through hidden speakers and candlelight danced across white tablecloths like tiny flames of intimacy. Marcus had called ahead, requested their favorite table by the window, the one that overlooked the city lights. Everything was perfect, or so he thought. His phone buzzed as he reached for the door handle. A text from Sarah. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. Something came up at work. My boss needs me for this emergency project. I can't make it tonight. I'm really sorry. Can we reschedule?" The world around him seemed to pause. The sounds of the city, car horns, distant laughter, the hum of evening traffic, all faded into a singular, uncomfortable silence. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, rereading the same words, hoping they would transform into something different. But they didn't. They remained a cancellation, an absence, a no. Marcus stood frozen for a moment longer, then pushed through the restaurant doors anyway. There was no logical reason to do this. He should have turned around, should have gone home, should have saved himself the pain of sitting alone at their table. But something deeper pulled him forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe he needed to feel the full weight of disappointment in the exact place where he'd imagined joy. The host at Mirrorstone recognized him immediately. "Mr. Marcus, welcome back. Your table is ready." The young man smiled warmly, unaware that tonight would be different, that the woman Marcus was meeting would not arrive. The restaurant was moderately busy, filled with couples in various stages of romance. Some were deep in conversation, their eyes locked across candlelit plates. Others sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing someone so completely that words become optional. Marcus felt like a ghost moving through their happiness as the host led him to the window table. The very table that was meant to hold 2 people but would now hold only 1. He sat down, the velvet box suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his pocket. Around him, the soft jazz continued its gentle melody. Waiters moved with practiced grace, refilling wine glasses and presenting dishes with ceremonial precision. The city lights outside created a beautiful backdrop, indifferent to his heartbreak. The waiter approached with the menus. "Will the lady be joining you soon, sir?" "She's running late," Marcus lied. "Maybe just water for now." He sat there for 20 minutes, watching the empty chair across from him like it might suddenly become occupied. His eyes traced the patterns of the tablecloth, the arrangement of silverware, the way the candlelight created dancing shadows. He wondered if Sarah was really at work. He wondered if she'd thought about him at all. He wondered if the 4 years they'd spent together meant anything close to what he'd believed it meant. Then, around the time he'd decided to leave, the host approached again. "Sir, there's been a small mix-up. We have another guest who needs a table, and she's dining alone as well. Would you mind if she sat at your table? We're quite full this evening, and it would help us accommodate her." "Of course, only if you're comfortable." Marcus almost said no. He was about to decline when he looked up and saw her. A woman in her late 20s, with auburn hair falling past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to carry their own stories. She wore a deep blue dress that caught the light like water, and there was something in her expression, a quiet strength mixed with her own sadness, that made him pause. "Sure," he found himself saying. "That's fine." As she approached the table, she smiled apologetically. "Thank you for this. I had a reservation, but my date didn't show. Figured sitting alone felt worse than sitting with a stranger." She extended her hand. "I'm Elena." Marcus shook her hand, noticing how warm it was. "Marcus, and for what it's worth, my company didn't show up either." Elena sat down across from him, and for the first time that evening, something shifted. They ordered wine, a red blend that the sommelier recommended, and they began to talk. At first, the conversation was careful. the kind strangers use when they're still measuring each other. But as the minutes passed and the wine deepened their honesty, something unexpected happened. Elena asked him why he'd come alone anyway. Marcus found himself telling her everything. About Sarah, about the 4 years. About the small box in his pocket that now felt like the saddest prop in a failed play. He didn't hold back or pretend that his pain was smaller than it was. Elena listened without interruption, her green eyes focused entirely on him. When he finished, she reached across the table and placed her hand near his. Not touching, but close enough that the distance felt intentional. "Significant, for what it's worth," she said softly. "Anyone who would choose work over a night with someone who clearly cares this much about them is making a massive mistake." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. Not the pain of Sarah's cancellation, but something else. Something that felt like the first small crack in a door he didn't know was closed. The evening unfolded in ways he never anticipated. They ordered food and ate slowly, talking between bites. Elena told him about her own heartbreak, about a man named James who had promised forever and delivered betrayal instead. She talked about how she'd learned to enjoy her own company, to take herself on dates, to prove to herself that she was enough even when the world suggested otherwise. By the time dessert arrived, Marcus realized something remarkable. He hadn't thought about Sarah in nearly an hour. His attention, his energy, his presence had been completely consumed by the woman sitting across from him, the stranger who'd become somehow familiar in the span of a single evening. As the night drew toward closing, Elena excused herself to the bathroom. Marcus sat alone with his thoughts, running his thumb over the velvet box still in his pocket. He thought about fate, about choices, about the strange way life sometimes rewrites its own story. When Elena returned, she looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd been thinking about something too. "This is going to sound crazy," she said, sitting back down. "But I'm glad my date didn't show up tonight." Marcus smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since Sarah's text message. "I'm beginning to feel exactly the same way." As the restaurant staff began their closing procedures around them, Marcus and Elena found themselves reluctant to leave. The magic of the evening seemed too fragile to disturb. They ordered coffee, and Elena finally asked him the question that had been hovering between them all night. "Why do you still have that box?" she asked gently. "The one in your pocket. I've noticed you touching it throughout the evening." Marcus pulled it out slowly, as if handling something sacred and simultaneously broken. He opened it to reveal a bracelet rather than a ring, a delicate gold piece with small stones that caught the light. It was beautiful in its subtlety. "I was planning to give this to Sarah tonight," he explained. "It was supposed to be a symbol, not an engagement, but a commitment. Something that meant, I'm all in. I'm choosing you. I'm ready to build something real with you." He paused, looking at the bracelet. "Instead, I'm sitting here with a complete stranger, wondering if the universe is telling me something important." Elena reached out and gently touched the bracelet, but didn't take it. "The fact that you carried this tonight, that you came to the restaurant anyway, that you were ready to give your heart even after she canceled, that says everything about who you are, Marcus. It says you're the kind of person who shows up, literally and figuratively. Sarah wasn't ready for that, but maybe." She trailed off, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "Maybe what?" Marcus asked, though he already knew what she wasn't quite saying. "Maybe someone else is," Elena whispered. They sat in that moment together, the air between them charged with possibility. A waiter approached politely, indicating the restaurant would be closing soon. Reluctantly, they gathered their things. As they stood to leave, Marcus made a decision. "I don't want this night to end," he said. "Would you maybe like to walk? There's a park nearby, and the city lights are beautiful from there." Elena nodded without hesitation. "I'd like that." Outside, the city had transformed into the quiet hours between evening and night. The streets were less crowded now, the air cooler and somehow more intimate. They walked side by side, their conversation flowing naturally as it had throughout dinner. Marcus found himself telling Elena about his childhood, about his dreams, of opening his own business someday, about the small apartment he rented that had never quite felt like a home. Elena shared her own stories. She'd grown up in a small town, the daughter of a librarian mother and a musician father. She'd moved to the city 5 years ago to escape a life that felt too predictable, and now she worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm. She'd come to the restaurant tonight because her friend had set up a blind date, but the man had ghosted her an hour before they were supposed to meet. Instead of going home in defeat, she'd decided to keep the reservation anyway. "I figured," she said with a laugh, "that I deserved a nice dinner regardless of whether a man showed up or not." "Your friend did you a favor," Marcus said. "By standing you up, he made sure you'd be exactly where you needed to be." They reached the park, and Elena guided him to a spot she clearly knew. There was a bench overlooking a small pond, and beyond that, the skyline of the city rose like a crown of lights. They sat, and for a long moment, they simply existed together in the quiet. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elena said finally. "Do you think you're going to call Sarah? Try to work things out?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, really considering the question. In that silence, he realized something crucial. His initial hurt about Sarah's cancellation had been genuine, but it was already fading. What he'd felt during the evening with Elena, the genuine connection, the sense of being truly seen, was something he hadn't experienced with Sarah in months, maybe longer. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I am. I think Sarah and I have been drifting for a while, and I was too invested in the idea of us to notice. Tonight helped me see that clearly." As if on cue, his phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Marcus, I'm so sorry about tonight. I feel terrible. Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." He read the message twice, then put his phone away without responding. Whatever Sarah needed to tell him could wait. Right now, he was exactly where he needed to be. "My date just texted me," he told Elena. "But honestly, I don't care what she has to say, because I'm starting to realize that sometimes when plans fall through, it's not a failure, it's redirection." Elena took his hand then, her fingers intertwining, with his naturally, like they'd been doing this for years. "That's very philosophical for someone who got stood up. I prefer to think of it as someone who showed up to the wrong table and found exactly the right person," Marcus replied. They stayed at the park until the city's nightlights began to dim with the approaching dawn. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and movies and dreams and fears. When it was finally time to leave, they exchanged contact information, though both of them knew this wouldn't be the last time they saw each other. Over the following days, what had started as a chance encounter became something intentional. Marcus and Elena began seeing each other deliberately, building something real from the foundation that had formed so unexpectedly. Sarah's message the next day revealed that she'd been seeing someone else and didn't know how to tell him. The news that would have devastated him a week earlier now felt almost inconsequential. Marcus returned to Mirrorstone 2 weeks later, but this time with Elena as his planned companion. As they were seated at the same table by the window, the host smiled knowingly. "Welcome back, Mr. Marcus. I'm glad you decided to give this table another chance." Marcus looked across at Elena, who was glowing in the candlelight, and squeezed her hand. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor and excellent timing. Sometimes the person you're supposed to meet isn't the one you're searching for. Sometimes they're the one who finds you when you're broken enough to actually be ready for something real. Sometimes a canceled dinner becomes the most important reservation you never planned to keep.